All right, well, hello and welcome to our lunch study break for Wednesday, April 28th. It's good to see people filing in here. This is the conclusion of a series of lunch study breaks that we've been having over the past few weeks around the end of the world. So Laura, and for some others who are joining us for the first time, I want you to know that this came out of my Seder conversation that I had with my children. We opened the door for Elijah. And we sang, and then my kids asked, who's Elijah? And I said, Elijah is the one who comes to tell us the Messiah is coming. And then the kids asked, who's the Messiah? And I said, he's the one who comes at the end of the world to bring peace and make everybody happy. To which my kids said, the end of the world? Okay, and that led to the end of our Seder, first of all, and tears, and to, I think, a fruitful few weeks of conversation that we've been having here around what is the Jewish idea around the end of the world. Now, for the past 2 weeks, we've been studying Gershom Sholom's text, which comes from his classic book, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. So if you're interested in learning more about Jewish mysticism, you can read Sholom's classic book. But today I wanted to personalize it and bring it into the theological realm, where I'm a little more comfortable than you might have noticed I am in the Kabbalistic realm. So Rabbi Gillman has prepared this wonderful essay that I found, in which he was asked to contribute to a series of people thinking about the future and sort of the scientific ramifications of the future. And he contributed a piece on what is the Jewish idea of death and the afterlife, and so many of those different strands that I think Marv, you, and some others have been trying to piece together, what biblically or rabbinically, it's sort of loose, those strands, and I think Rabbi Gillman pulls them together quite nicely. So if you'll allow me, I'll go into a little bit of a teaching. Let me put in the chat if anybody wants to, how do I put a file in the chat here? There should be a way to put a file in the chat. Okay, so the file will soon be appearing in your chat there. That has my underlines, but I'm going to share it with everybody here. And he does just a wonderful job of really, Marv, I think we're going to get it. I think we're going to get it here. So if you have any questions, just stop me, but he's going to take us through, and I think he's going to explain the history. So the piece is called The Jewish Theology of Death and the Afterlife. And we've tried to teach the death of death, but in this wonderful essay that he wrote I guess maybe he wrote this 15, 16 years ago, maybe 2004, 2003. He sums up what he wrote in his book, The Death of Death. And so he made a number of claims, and these are the three primarily. So with the exception of three brief passages, Isaiah in 25 and 26 and Daniel chapter 12, the Bible denies any form of life after death other than some shadowy form of persistence in which is termed Sheol, which is a realm in the bowels of the earth where the dead are cut off from God and from relations with other dead people, and from which there is no return. Okay, that's the first of his claim. The second is that in the early post-biblical period, from the 2nd century BCE until the 1st century, really the axial age, two doctrines of life after death become progressively more prominent. And that is the resurrection of the body and the immortality of the soul. And third, that later in the rabbinic texts, these two doctrines are conflated, so that at the end of life on earth, the soul separates from the body and the body disintegrates in the earth and the soul journeys to be with God. So at the end of the days, the body and the soul will be reunited, and the individual human being reconstituted as during life on earth will come before judgment, allowing for this, Gillman says, allows for various reinterpretations for medieval Jewish philosophers and mystics, some of which we studied a little bit, to conflate those doctrines. And basically he says this conflated doctrine remained canonical in Judaism until the rise of the Jewish Enlightenment near the close of the 18th century, in which in Jewish liberal circles, bodily resurrection was dismissed as a primitive superstition. So from about the first, second century until the 18th century, this was the notion, this dual aspect, these two conflated notions that came into existence around 2nd century, 1st century BCE of the idea of physical bodily resurrection and spiritual immortality. Okay, let me go on. The net effect of these three claims is that the Hebrew scripture affirms both the reality of death and its finality. The post-biblical tradition denies both. The doctrine of resurrection denies the finality of death, and the doctrine of immortality denies its reality. Okay, so the scriptures affirm both the reality of death and its finality, Marv, and the post-biblical tradition denies both. You with me? Okay, good. Now, though it is not rare to find the rabbinical tradition circumventing or even overturning biblicals, there is no underestimating the revolutionary character of this transformation. So at a certain point in Jewish history, the scriptural denial of the very possibility of life after death was clearly perceived as no longer tenable and was replaced. All right. Now, in his earlier work, he made a cursory attempt to account for this reversal. Other attempts have drawn on methodologies such as historical critical analyses. We're not going to do that here. He says this chapter constitutes an attempt to pursue that inquiry in a more thorough fashion. He says, okay, my approach here will be less historical and less text-based and more phenomenological, psychological, and theological. Maybe in reading that sentence, you understand me as a rabbi. My approach here is less historical and text-based and more phenomenological, psychological, and theological. And he will attempt to speculate about the mindset of the Jewish community during that period to discover what dissatisfactions with the biblical tradition might have contributed to this radical transformation. Is everybody with me? Anybody not with me? Anybody have a question? All right, good. Let's keep going. Let's dig into it. Okay, so the theological issues at the heart of the turnabout are the easiest to uncover and the most fruitful place to begin. So the biblical insistence on both the reality and the finality of death raises two central theological problems. First, the justice, and secondly, the sovereignty of the monotheistic God. Okay, so we've got two key problems that need to be resolved if we acknowledge the finality of death, which is God's justice and God's sovereignty. Now, the classic biblical justification for human suffering is it's God's punishment to sin, right? We read this all the time in our text. We'll be loyal to God. God will bring about blessing. Disobedience will bring about curse. Rabbi Gillman highlights here Deuteronomy 11, 13 to 21, which is the classic statement of that doctrine. It is only because this text is recited twice daily by the worshiping Jew in the morning and in the evening, and it is at the heart of the prescribed liturgy. We say this as part of our Shema. Now, in Judaism, as in the Roman Catholic Mass, it is the liturgy. Now, this is important here. It's a little nuance that I think Beth Sholom should think about, because we're focused a lot on text here, but it's the liturgy that articulates the central doctrines of our faith community, right? If you think about that, that's what we say when we come together. So we have to think about what the liturgy says. Beyond this, one of the conventional understandings of the ecology of death in the Bible is in the interpretation of Genesis chapter 3, according to which Adam and Eve are punished from having eaten from the forbidden fruit by death. In the prophetic and later rabbinic historiography, the destruction of the two temples in 586 and in 70 were understood as the punishment for sins, right? We all know the story of baseless hatred. We baselessly hated each other, sinat chinam, and so the second temple was destroyed. So Rabbi Gillman wants you to understand the power of this theological doctrine. And let's see how he does that. So Clifford Geertz, his classic studies, is a mid-20th century thinker of the way religion accounts for the eruption of chaos in God's ordered world suggests that it must meet three challenges. Okay, so Geertz says that for religion to work in a chaotic world, it has to solve three key challenges. The first is an intellectual challenge. It must explain in a way that's acceptable intellectually to all of you. Otherwise, it's going to be like a flying spaghetti man, right? It's not going to work intellectually. Number two has to be an emotional challenge. It has to give us some means to cope with suffering that exists in the world. Why is there suffering? Right? God made everything, so God's all powerful. Why is there suffering? Third, a moral challenge. It must justify or vindicate the divine judgment that caused the pain that exists. We have to explain it morally. So the biblical account has no problem with all of these. Intellectually, we know why suffering happens. It's punishment for sin. Provides a way to cope for the suffering by teaching you how not to get the punishment. And finally, with repentance and teshuvah, we can have a moral God, right? So God's justice remains inviolate. Everybody with me up to this point? Biblical, there's no problem. Now, as a testimony to the enduring power of this doctrine, we need simply to note that in this day, there are certain Jewish traditional circles. The Nazi Holocaust is justified by using it as God's punishment for the sins of European Jewry. All right. Now, most contemporary Jews view this position with a sense of horror. That's not what I wanted to do. Most contemporary Jews view this position with horror, but the fact remains that it is still staunchly upheld in some right-wing circles. It just is. So it shows how powerful the biblical doctrine of reward and punishment is. Now, restricting ourselves to the biblical version of the doctrine would raise multiple problems. Preeminently, the fact that though it might account for communal suffering, it seems to fail to account for me. What about me? And I know we talk about people, what about the individual? We could talk about famine and military defeat do not discriminate between sinners and individuals who might have remained righteous. Beyond this, it was patently clear to the authors of the Bible that many religious human beings suffer terribly for reasons that we just don't know why that is. This is accentuated in the book of Job, which deals with the suffering of an individual and explicitly rejects the doctrine. So very quickly in the book of Job, Job is a righteous man who suffers terribly because God is responding to Satan's challenge, his little game, his test. God frees Satan to injure Job, which he does, but Job never denounces God. Job's consolers advance the traditional explanation that Job's suffering. They all come up to him for 39 poetic chapters and tell him, you did wrong. That's the biblical idea. You did wrong. But Job never accepts that. He insists he never sinned. We know he never sinned. And at the end of the book, God confirms Job was right all along and that his suffering was never intended to be a punishment. God also denounces his friends with their traditional doctrine of the biblical notion of reward and punishment, which we just talked about. It's a very confusing book, how that's in the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. So Rabbi Gillman says this leaves us with a frightful dilemma because the traditional doctrine of suffering as punishment is rejected clearly in the book of Job. God never really tells Job why he suffered, apart from the sublime speeches that he says out of the whirlwind, which are a paean to the complexity and majesty of God's creation, and to the fact that no human being could ever possibly understand God. At the end, Job himself seems to have achieved a little bit of closure, but the reader, Gillman says, is bewildered, and all three of Geertz's challenge remain unanswered in the book of Job. Job never understands why he suffered. He's left with no resources to cope with his suffering, and God's justice remains a complete mystery to Job. Now, of the three biblical texts that Rabbi Gillman noted do affirm some form of life after death, it's really Daniel 12, which you've heard me talk about before, is the only one that can be dated with some accuracy. It's usually around the time of Antiochus, which we know is the Maccabee story, around 166, 165 BCE. And we know that during the reign, the temple was desecrated. It's the story of Hanukkah. And so the Jews' victory is celebrated, that we were able to, under the Hashmonean dynasty, we celebrate this on Hanukkah, but in the course of these persecutions, multitudes of righteous Jews were no doubt martyred because they refused to worship a pagan god. So here was a community that embodied Job's paradox, where you had righteous Jews who were dying explicitly because of their loyalty of God. He also wants to say that the author clearly identifies with the Maccabees, offering what is nothing less than a theological motivation for martyrdom, and thus implicitly a recruitment pamphlet for the Maccabees. So he's got Daniel chapter 12 as a recruitment pamphlet for the Maccabees. The core of his argument is that the community is facing a crisis, the like of which has never been seen since the nation came into being. At that time, your people will be rescued, all who were found inscribed in the book. And then many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to eternal life, other to reproaches, to everlasting abhorrence. This passage is arguably one of the most discussed verses in the entire Hebrew Bible, and it answers the question, why should Jews accept martyrdom? Why indeed, if their death will mark the absolute end, not only of their life, but of any future relationship with God? How could their suffering ever be justified? So the traditional doctrine of suffering as punishment did not apply to these pious Jews, nor could the book of Job provide any alternative explanation to make them feel any better. Why not simply join those Jews who were abandoning God? Daniel's answer is to broaden the frame of God's relationship with humanity. God's justice may not be fully manifest during our 120 years here on earth. Just might not be. We might be born during the wrong 120 years, and God's justice is not manifest on earth. But if there's an afterlife, then eventually the righteous will be rewarded and the evildoers will be punished. So martyrdom now becomes a justifiable expression of the faith. Now he'll say here, we shall claim below that theology never arises in a vacuum. Listen to this. I think this is particularly relevant today. Theological revolutions invariably emerge out of an existential crisis. Well, what are we in now if not an existential crisis? On a purely theological level, then, the emergence of Daniel's denial of the finality of death met that existential need. Dead people were dying, they were just, and they were righteous. And God had to explain that in a way that could make moral, intellectual, and human sense. So the dating of the book of Job is uncertain, though it is conventionally assigned to the 4th to 5th century BCE. Daniel is mid-2nd century BCE. The notion that at some point in the near future, dead bodies will rise for the earth, and that is the only way we can understand the statement, those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, must be understood as the answer to the quandary posed by the conclusion of the book of Job. And so eschatology, which means the study of the end of days, becomes theodicy. Theodicy is, why does God let bad things happen to good people? Gertz's challenges are now met once again. Believers can understand why they suffered, for after all, human beings sometimes do terrible things to one another, but they now have a means to cope with their martyrdom, the assurance that they will live again, and God's justice will remain inviolate, for the righteous will earn eternal life and the evildoers eternal abomination. Daniel's promise of life after death applies only to a limited portion of the community, right? Only to those special folk. It doesn't say anything about Haaretz, about the rest of us, most of us, who are neither righteous nor evil. Nor does it hold out any hope for the generations which came prior. But within 2 centuries, those qualifications disappear. Again, it is the liturgy that most explicitly reflects the expansion of the doctrine. And at the heart of the tefillah, our amidah, the central portion of the daily liturgy, one of the sections there is the Gevurot section. The dating of this passage, he's not sure about. It's assumed that the passage developed over time, but scholars agree the current version of the passage, probably middle of the 1st century CE. And let me open it up here for all of you to see. Here it is. You are all well familiar with it from our services here. Ata gibor le'olam Adonai. Remember when this is from. Ata gibor le'olam Adonai mechayei metim ata rav lehoshia. Your might, that's what they mean by gevura, gibor, Adonai is boundless. You give life to the dead, great is your saving power. Mechakel chaim bechesed. Mechayei metim berachamim rabim, somech noflim v'rofeh cholim umatir azurim umekayem emunato lishnei afar. Mi chamocha ba'al gevurot, umi dome lach, melech memit umchaye umatzmiach Yeshua. V'ne'eman ata lachayot metim, baruch ata Adonai mechaye hametim. Your love sustains the living, you grant mercies, give life to the dead, you support the failing, you heal the sick, you free the fettered, you keep your faith with those who sleep in the dust. We say this every day. Whose power can compare to you? You are the master of life and death. Faithful are you in giving life to the dead. Praised are you, Adonai, master of life and death. All right, so that's right there in our liturgy. Middle of the 1st century CE. This is a passage which praises God's power, which is now manifest in God's healing of the sick, supporting the falling, releasing the confined. 6 times in this passage, the single one of God's mighty acts that is repeated again and again is giving life to the dead. So 2 points should be made about this passage. First, the frame is now bigger. It's not only Daniel's contemporaries and the really good ones who will be brought back to life. Now it's all the dead from the beginning of time until the end of time. Claim is now rooted in the specific historical context. This claim is not, rooted in the specific historical context. It's just much broader now. One dimension of God's sovereign power is the ability to give life to the dead. Second, the theological claim no longer addresses the issue of God's justice, but rather God's power. The ability to overcome death is now a statement about God's unfettered power. The entire passage ties God's power to the theme of reversal. God has the power to reverse the natural course of events by, for example, healing the sick. So one of those reversals is God's power to conquer death. I'm going to take us to spiritual immortality, and then I'm going to stop and take some questions. So it's not at all clear, Gillman says, why the earlier biblical tradition denied that God had the power to overcome death. It might have reflected a wish to avoid blurring the distinction between God and human beings. Human beings die, God is eternal. Or it might have reflected the biblical preoccupation with avoiding the pagan practice of necromancy. The Bible explicitly prohibits this practice, for which it prescribes death as one of a number of pagan cultic rites that it finds abhorrent. We just studied that. The preoccupation is to establish a clear distinction between Israelite religion and paganism. But by the end of the biblical age, both of those factors paled in the light of other more pressing theological demands, namely the need to vindicate God's justice in the wake of a traumatic historical experience in which pious Jews were martyred precisely because of their piety. If God's power to affect the destiny of human beings ceased with the death of the person, then it could be claimed that death was more powerful than God. It could be claimed that death was more powerful than God. Then, in fact, death was the ultimate power in the world, and death should be worshipped, Gillman says. But that possibility was inconceivable. It then became necessary to affirm that God's power extends beyond the grave. God now has the power to renew life for all of the dead from time immemorial. From here, it is but a short step to the final affirmation that at the end of days, not only will the dead arise again, but death itself will die at the end of days. That final step is most explicit in Chad Gadya, what we read on Pesach. Literally one goat. It's composed of the model of a nursery rhyme where each stanza builds on another. My father bought a goat, the cat bit the goat, the dog bit the cat, that bit the goat, that my father bought, and so on. At the end, the slaughterer slaughters the cow, then the angel of death slaughters the slaughterer. And finally, to our surprise, come the words with which both the entire liturgy and the evening end. Then came the holy blessed one who slaughtered the angel of death. This should have been my answer, Marv, to my kids. Don't worry, God's going to come down and kill the angel of death at the end, not to worry. This final stanza marks a formidable leap in the imagination of the poet. He did personally see all of the other links in the chain. He did see the cats biting the goats. He saw the dogs biting the cats. He saw the slaughterers slaughtering the cows. He even saw the slaughterers die. But what he never saw was the death of the angel of death. That final link in the chain of mortality is reversed for the eschatological age, the age of our ultimate redemption. It thus forms the most fitting close for the festival that celebrates redemption. The death of the angel of death at the hands of God signifies what a teacher of mine once called the final step in the triumphant march of the monotheistic idea. All right, that only took me about 25 minutes. There is more, and there's a lot of good stuff left to get to, but that's a good background. So, are there questions? Are there questions? Anybody want to comment? By the way, here's the article again. If you guys didn't have a chance to get the article. Yeah, and I'm going to keep going in the article. Okay, so I've got a number of questions. So Howard, why don't you start? Well, you're muted, Howard.
Okay, what is the afterlife?
What does it look like?
I mean,
We'll get to that.
I mean,
So
is that going to heaven, or is that
well, that is in the realm of the mystics, what that looks like. And the mystics will come up with a whole bunch of ideas for what the realm is. But what Gillman is establishing here is that at some point, 2,000 years ago, we expanded the worlds. First, we were just in this world, and then we went to this world and the world to come. And in that addition of that second world, it helps solve some of the questions of why bad things happen to good people. And it gave people the domain with which they can be creative to figure out what happens after they die. But I don't have the answer to that question here. Marv.
But no matter what you come up with, somehow you have to find, for its validity, you have to find something in the Torah to support your story. So what in the Torah lends belief to this eschatological storyline?
Just those three passages. The three passages, he said there are only three. And he acknowledges, right, there are two from Isaiah 25 and 26.
Well, no, that's not in the 5 books of Moses.
Oh, no, there's nothing in the Torah.
So doesn't everything have to stand on some interpretation of the Torah that allows you to lend legitimacy to whatever you propose?
So the rabbis, after this shift, after Daniel expanded the frame, were able then to go back to the 5 books of Moses and to play with words and to pick out concepts and to develop numerology and whatever else they were able to develop once that frame got expanded by Daniel. But what Rabbi Gillman says is that prior to then, there was no idea. Death was death. Death was death. That's it. Gary?
I'm a little struck and troubled by the part of the Amida, especially since we talk about context. And I was once taught that the Amida is divided into 3 parts: praise, petitions, and thanks. If this part came in the part about petitions or thanks, it might support the thesis being raised here, but this comes in the part on praise. So I'm not sure how it's supportive of the thesis.
The words are supportive of the thesis.
Yeah, but they're kind of like the words that they're the buttering up part before we get to the part where we make our petitions. That's why I say, I mean.
Okay, all right, that's good. There you go. All right, that's a good, I like it. That's a good traditional, good Yekka Jew who is saying, hey, you know, you've got to understand the concept of this. This is the buttering up process. We did 3 steps back, 3 steps forward. We bowed. We got to butter up the Lord before we ask him to heal us and all that sort of stuff. This is part of that. Don't be so literal and make it a whole metaphysic. Okay, that's Gary's point. Jeff?
Yeah, I just wanted you to know the article, I guess you highlighted it, but it's coming through, it's redacted. It's like you're the CIA.
Oh my. Okay, so I'll send an unredacted version. Hold on. I actually have an unredacted version. All right, this should work. This will not have my edits on it. Okay, Raf, go right ahead, Raf.
Okay, sorry if this is taking everybody backwards and if this is building on stuff that the series has already covered. I think I followed like 5% of that.
Oh, all right.
In Google Speak, which is totally idiosyncratic and not useful all the time, we have these acronyms that we overuse. One is just TLDR, too long, didn't read. What the hell was that about? Like, what is the 2 sentence here, man? Like,
I'll give it to you. Ready? In the Hebrew Bible, when you die, you die. It's over. There's no afterlife. You're buried. There's no future relationship with God. There's no heaven. There's nothing in the Hebrew Bible that says there's life after death. Period. There are 3 examples found in the Hebrew Bible that were used around the turn of the millennium to answer the question, why are we all getting killed when we're righteous? Because we read in our Hebrew scriptures that God takes care of the righteous, but the righteous are getting killed. Why is that? So this prophet comes along named Daniel and says, well, I'll tell you why that is. That is because at the end of days, God will resurrect the dead, the righteous from the earth, and will judge them. So that is a change in the history of how we understand what happens when you die. The book of Daniel, chapter 12, says something happens to you after you die. Then after that happened, the rabbis had to go and build on that idea to answer individual questions of why does bad things happen to me? Why, as an individual, I've suffered, I live under this Babylonian diaspora, I'm being abused, my family members are being assaulted, I'm virtuous, I'm good. Why is this happening to me? It's happening. We need an explanation for that. And so they broadened the notion to include 2 concepts which come out of the book of Daniel and of this sort of axial age. And he's going to get into Plato in a little bit. And these 2 notions, we couldn't answer it. So normally, Raf, what he was saying is during the times of the Bible, something bad happens. Why does it happen? Well, you didn't worship the law. That's why something bad happened. Okay, great. Now tell me, why did Rabbi Akiva die? Why did this stuff happen? How do you explain that? Okay, you explain that because at the end of days, Rabbi Akiva is going to be uplifted and God will be just. God can't be unjust for us. And in doing that, the rabbis then expanded that notion of what happens at the end of days to include everybody, and then conflated these 2 notions that grew out of the 1st century prior and this 1st century after the CE, expanded it out to everyone, conflated this idea that after you die, rabbis pretty much for 1700 years told people you'll be resurrected at the end of days. Your immortal soul continues and will be merged with your body that will come up. And then in the 18th century, the Enlightenment said, this is ridiculous. What's going on here? Does that help?
that gets me to the 18th century.
Great. That's all I wanted to do. That's it. That's all I wanted to do in the first 25 minutes was to get you to the 18th century. Perfect. You are there. Awesome.
Okay, but I still want to engage, and I still think there's some interesting stuff that Gillman says around what it takes for religion to be successful that I think is super challenging.
Correct. That's exactly why I want to study this. That's why I've spent my life studying this. It's super, super challenging, especially when you think about technology, especially when you think about this century and the existential questions that maybe we might have to acknowledge that maybe the answers that Congregation Beth Sholom gave 80 years ago to some of these questions no longer resonate because we have gone through an existential crisis. And so then the question becomes, how do we answer those questions in a way that he's using the Clifford Geertz in a way that explains it intellectually and explains it morally, and I forget the third one. Ben Chin.
Yeah, but we still haven't gotten to the modern period. So we haven't even got to the thing that you want to reject yet. Right?
I don't want to I'm not rejecting anything.
Well, not rejecting. That you're suggesting that we might need to transcend. We haven't even gotten to that yet.
Well, I think there are some people who will say we might need to transcend. And by the way, I think—
Well, you're saying that. You just said it. You just said we might need to do something now that we weren't doing 80 years ago.
We might.
We might.
We might.
But we haven't even gotten to that yet. We haven't even gotten yet to what we were doing 80 years ago. Okay, so I want to get there.
We did a little bit. We did say what we did 80 years ago. And we said 80 years ago, we rejected biblical theology.
Right, but we haven't talked about what we replaced it with.
So let's go forward.
Yeah, okay, wait. I have one little question first, though. If you can answer it in like 20 seconds, which is, I get the answers to the second and third criteria of Geertz. I might have missed, did you get an answer to the first question?
What was it? Morality? What is it?
The first one was an intellectual. No, we
intellectual, emotional, and moral.
Right. But the questions as to theodicy. But what's the answer to the reason why we live in a chaotic world? That was a piece of it, which I don't know if we spoke to. We answered why bad things happen to good people. And we answered sort of, essentially what are the elements of the good and the good life, right? But part of that question is why we live in a chaotic world to begin with. Why would God set up the universe this way?
And the old answers don't work for that. You got it. I'm going to move forward.
What was the old answer?
The old answer is because you didn't follow God's will.
No. Why we live in a world that is chaotic for everybody all the time? That's what he's saying, right? He's saying we live in a chaotic world.
Okay. Yes. So why? We need an explanation. So why did we come into this chaotic world? Okay. The traditional answer is to be holy in this world, to be a light unto the nations. I mean, there's a really lame traditional rabbinic answer to that.
Okay.
But let me move on, Marv, if you don't mind. Spiritual immortality. Okay, so it's not clear what the liturgists who composed this understood when they praised God for the resurrection of the dead. When Daniel 12 prophesied that those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awaken, he could only have meant bodily resurrection, because what else sleeps in the dust of the earth? So the liturgical phrase then does include bodily resurrection, but it may also mean what we referred to earlier as the conflated doctrine, whereby at the end of days, God will resurrect the body and unite it with our immortal soul. Okay. So the human being, therefore, is composed of two distinct elements. There's the body and the soul. This idea is nowhere to be found in the Bible. The Hebrew words nephesh and neshama, as Marv will be happy to tell you, which in post-biblical texts are commonly used for the word soul in the Bible, just merely referred to mean a living person. A material body that is animated by a divine breath that itself has no independent existence outside the body. The Bible knows nothing of Cartesian-style dualism. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead, where the doctrine of resurrection was borrowed maybe from Zoroastrianism, or whether it represents an internal development within biblical religion is not clear. But there is no dispute that the doctrine of immortality of the soul, here you go, Raf, entered into Judaism from Greek philosophy. All right? It is omnipresent in Plato. It has no biblical source, but it can be found in the apocryphal Wisdom of Solomon, believed to have been written by a Hellenized Jew in Alexandria about the middle of the 1st century CE. Later, it appears in rabbinic sources, as does what we have referred to as the conflated doctrine. In these Jewish sources, the doctrine is never as radical as it appears, for example, as it appears in Plato's Phaedo. Jewish sources never claim that the soul represents the real person, nor is there the sharp disparagement of the body that we find in the Greek sources. But the body and the soul are independent entities that at death, the soul departs the body to be with God, and that it will be reunited with the body at the end of days. This complex doctrine became normative in Jewish sources until the Enlightenment. That the doctrine has in fact become quasi-canonical is confirmed in the Mishnah. In Sanhedrin, it says all Israelites have a share to the age of come. In the Mishnah, it says all Israelites have a share in the age of come. And these are those who have no share in the age of come. He who says that there's no mention of the resurrection of the dead in the Torah. How about that, Marv? All Israel, in this Mishnah, all Israelites have a share in the age of the world to come. Those who don't have a share, the one who says it doesn't say resurrection of the dead in the Bible. I guess that's me in this class, so Rabbi Gillman. The Mishnah, conventionally understood to have been written around the year 200. He's saying, Rabbi Gillman notices that the presence of a theological doctrine in the Mishnah is unusual, but there it is. And by the dawn of the 3rd century, the Jewish denial of both the finality and even the reality of death has been an accomplished fact, about 5 centuries. The doctrine of bodily resurrection denies the finality of death. The doctrine of spiritual immortality denies its reality of death. And ultimately, rabbinical eschatology proclaims the very death of death itself. These traditions could not possibly envision the indefinite extension of life on earth as we moderns do, but it did claim the next best thing. To use rabbinic metaphor, life here on earth is but a vestibule before the age to come. That is found in Mishnah Avot. And the life that we enjoy in the age to come will be eternal. All right, I'm just going to read the next part. Theological revolutions of this kind we are studying here, I think this goes to Raf's point, can only emerge out of a profound existential crisis. The issue is nothing less than the fact that human beings must die, or speaking as a true existentialist, the fact that I must die. The issue is not death in the abstract, but the reality of my death. For one who worships the monotheistic God, the question is even a harsher edge. Why does God require or tolerate the death of human beings? Why does God require or tolerate my death? Why does a God who creates life in the first place, as Ben was asking, who, as the Jewish tradition claim, a living God, require and tolerate that we all must die? What's going on here? Ben wants to know. Why does this God who has Jews pray each high holiday season that will be remembered unto life at the same time require we must die, or tolerate the fact that we die? These questions raise an even prior question, the Jewish account of the origin of death. Did God create us to die? Ben wants to know. Or did God create us to be immortal, with death entering the world as the result of some human rebellious act, as the story of the Garden of Eden suggests? The answer to that question depends on our interpretation of obscure biblical texts and is subject of considerable scholarly inquiry beyond the scope of this chapter. However we answer that prior question, the fact remains that beginning with Genesis, throughout the Bible and thereafter, every human being, with the exception of Enoch, as related in Genesis 5, and later Elijah, everyone dies. Everybody dies in the Bible. Everybody dies in the Bible and is not heard from again. Okay, questions here. Don.
Yeah, just about everyone dies. I keep hearing that. And it's like, yeah, we all die here. But that doesn't mean the end. I think people think it means the end because we're so attached to here that we think that this is everything. From your own point of view, this is everything. And if it's not here anymore, that's death. Okay, there's like nothing. But I don't know where, even in Torah, where it specifically says there's nothing after death. It says you'll die. You will die, but you'll die to this. It doesn't mean something more, because the breath of God gave us. So what part of that breath that goes
classic? Sorry to interrupt you, Don. That's classic rabbinism. That's right. You don't have to read that text in that cold, scholarly way. You don't have to assume because it's not spoken that there's no life after death. It's a story which is a part of a larger story, and the rabbis, through the oral Torah over the past 2,000 years, have expanded on that story. That's right. That's how you can understand that, Don. Let's go. Marv, let me go around here. There are a few hands.
You do have a few ideas in the Torah. Number one, you do have the expression of duality, because when our patriarchs die, they're buried, then they're gathered to their kin. Two separate things happen. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is we're promised eternal possession of the land of Canaan. If you have eternal possession, you've got to be around to possess it. Then the third thing
Oh,
is
very nice.
then in
But
Exodus,
that doesn't refer to the individual, but okay.
then in Exodus, God says he's going to let Pharaoh know who he is. He's going to let the Israelites know who he is. And he's going to let all the nations know who he is. So that fits with the idea that we developed, that with the resurrection of all the Jews, that everyone will be gathered in Jerusalem, and then we will all worship the one God. So that also gives us a little, you can take all of this and start to form this answer to the existential crisis.
I think that's Kabbalah, for example, like that's what Kabbalah is. It's to leap off of this and to create that structure. Laura, I want to pause here. Curious to know if you have thoughts that you want to share with us. You have to unmute yourself.
It's a lot to cover. I'm just kind of taking in different perspectives here. I guess my initial thought is just, I'm not sure that there's a path to a clear answer, because a lot of it is just about how you define certain things. So if you define death as the death of your body, you define death as a passage of your soul somewhere else. So I feel like it's very much up for interpretation in that sense. That's right. And we've been arguing and interpreting that for 2,000 years. And the worst thing would be to give an answer. I want to go on because Laura gave me a beautiful segue into where Rabbi Gillman goes next. Is death a blessing? Now he compares his frame with the frame given by Dr. Sherwin Newland, who wrote a book in 1994 called How We Die. For Newland, death is the thoroughly natural and desirable end of everything that lives. We die so that others may live. For plants and animals, he writes, require renewal. Death is the invariable and ultimately welcome result of the natural cycle. We die in order to maintain the balance of nature. Newland even proposes his own version of the afterlife. We live on as a broader part of the broader ecosystem. His understanding of death reflects his personal values. It is shaped by his myth, by his personal way of making sense of the world. It is a singularly powerful myth. Rabbi Gillman says possibly even the reigning myth of our age, but it remains a myth. And by myth, he doesn't mean fiction. He means rather in the more academic sense, a myth being an imaginative way of shaping complex data into a structure of meaning. Did you catch that, Raf? Basically, it's a lens. He explained it best this way. He said the most interesting statement anyone ever said to him theologically came from his ophthalmologist, who said, you don't see with your eyes, you see with your brain. Because if you just saw with your eyes, all we would see are pixels and light and images and colors, and we couldn't process. We need our brain to create some model of all the data that's coming in. The brain has to interpret it somehow. It has to be some operating system. That operating system gives meaning to all of that bits that are out there. That's the myth, how he wants you to understand it. And so Newland has his myth. He gets it. This is the value system. Everything dies. Myths of this kind cannot be verified nor falsified. They can only be challenged by an alternative myth. There is no more explicit alternative to Newland's myth than the one provided by the Jewish tradition. To trace the contours of that alternative way of making sense of human existence is a singularly complex task. Jewish teachings are collected in multiple texts. He says, particularly in this modern age, our teachings reflect a good deal of disagreement, as Laura was pointing out, between the traditional, the liberal. To isolate a normative understanding of what Judaism has to say
on a single topic. I love this expression, is an inherently suspect enterprise. That's the best way anybody's ever put it. That's correct. Anybody's looking for what Judaism has to say. That's an inherently suspect. But here he says there's a surprising degree of unanimity because Judaism values every life as a gift from God. And that proposition leads to a series of conclusions, as with every theoretical teaching that eventually become codified in law. For example, Judaism forbids suicide. Some contemporary rabbinic authorities debate passive and active euthanasia, but that distinction remains blurred. There is also a large measure of agreement that the prolongation of life should not be qualified by quality of life factors. The most hotly debated issues revolve around withholding or withdrawing hydration and nutrition when death is imminent. On this issue, the more traditionalist authorities would forbid, but the more liberal would permit. To put all of this in a more positive terms, the aggressive treatment of the sick and the prolongation of life are divine commands. One of the most common metaphors for God is that he is the healer of the sick. Now here's, Laura, here's exactly what he's getting at here for you, and I think for everybody here. The choice between Newland's myth or the biblical myth or the rabbinic myth is a singularly subjective enterprise. It's hard for people, but just bear with him. It is an existential decision in the most technical sense of the term, a decision that does not claim to be rational or logical, that has a little objective basis, that is neither objectively true nor false, but represents an individual's conscious and deliberate, responsible choice for which one is prepared to risk one's life and destiny. It's just everything. What are you willing to put your life on? You're going to put your life on science, or you're going to put your life on something else? So for him, he says the decision is clear. Writing as a believing Jew, I cannot but view my death as an absurdity. It is an eruption of chaos. His problem with Newland's myth is that it might work for plants and animals. It doesn't work for him. He says the difference is awareness. Not only must I die, but I know I'm going to die. Plants and animals, they don't. He says that difference is not insignificant. I've lived my entire life with a looming awareness, growing steadily the older that I get, that I will die, Gillman says. That double burden shapes me every waking moment. I view my death as an enemy to be resisted as long as possible. Even more, I want my physicians to share that view. My fear is that Dr. Newland's myth in some subtle, even barely conscious way may inform clinical decisions that may have to be made as my death approaches, and I confess I have not yet faced that moment. All I can do at this point is lift my voice and speak as candidly as I can. The fact remains I will die, and his myth enables me to face my death with the certainty that at the end of days, I will live. Hasten me, at the end of days, I will live again, reconstituted as I was during my years here on earth. I hasten to add that this faith is by no means biological or scientific. The reality is no more than any other human being. No, do I know with certainty what will happen. But what I believe will happen to me after I die makes an enormous difference in the way I live today. In that sense, my belief is a mythic claim, less a statement about the future than a statement about the present and about the way I make sense of my existence today. Oh, we're almost done. Look at this. We made it to the end. However, we understand the biblical view of the etiology of death and of God's role in introducing or tolerating the reality of death. Judaism soon came to proclaim the defeat of death at the end of days. In historical time, God is not yet fully God. Until then, we can only wait and we can hope. Hope may be the most precious resource we have. Hope is an act of defiance against despair, against scientific positivism. Hope, particularly hope against hope, that surges within us when all the tests are positive and all the statistics are stacked against us. That kind of hope does not deny the value of the critical impulse. It simply challenges its imperialism. Without that kind of hope, how is it possible to live? I finished the whole article with 3 minutes to spare. Okay, Raf, you're itching to get in here. Do it.
You ready for some tough love?
I'd love it. Do it.
I don't know what he's added. I don't understand, like, what the hell just happened. You could replace Judaism with this, in this lens, with the humanist, non-religious, shit's complicated, life's a struggle. I've gained nothing. I'm kind of frustrated, but I'm not sure if it's me or.
No, I love it. No, I love the frustration. I think I experienced that frustration with Rabbi Gillman when I was his student. Because he used to say, I believe my myth. The myth works for me on Mondays, on Thursdays, and on Saturdays, but on Sundays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays, it doesn't work for me. And for me, that just seemed like totally wishy-washy, totally subjective, totally not moored or rooted in anything. And it prevented me from making any statements, or any of us from making any statements about anything that we can't, that aren't subjective. It just prevented that from happening. So I wanted something more, and I would always push for something more, for a real sense of felt God. And for him, it was like this intellectual framework that he could get into, that he could feel, that he could live when he was at shul. But that's pretty much when it worked for him. So I
remember, I think at some other session, maybe it was a week or two ago, we had put like Kaplan next to somebody, and you had talked about like they kind of differed on the necessity of like a divine spark or revelation or something like that. Like, this is not my cup of theology. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to figure out what he wants to know from you. And so you don't have to answer this question now, because I'm going to get to Ben, but maybe you can consider this and we can talk later on, which is, what is a way that we can answer Geertz's 3 issues with all the garbage going on in this world? How can we use Torah and Judaism to answer Geertz's 3 questions about how it makes sense intellectually, morally, and emotionally? And that's ultimately my takeaway from all of this, in addition to my frustration with Rabbi Gillman. Because what do you believe, Neil? In addition to that, which I'm glad you brought up, I think it provides us a framework for thinking about the current existential crisis we're in. Ben.
Yeah, I share Raf's frustration, and I think the way you know that a myth is a myth is that you shouldn't be able to see outside it, right? And Gillman clearly can. So it's not a live myth for him. It's not an operative myth, because you can't, if you're operating within a mythos, you shouldn't be able to see things any other way.
So it's a broken
really.
myth. It's a broken myth.
It's beyond broken.
It's second naivete. Are you familiar with this concept of second?
Yeah, and so it doesn't work, really. So
I always had it. Well, it's always hard. Like, once you believe Santa Claus isn't real, can you really accept a second time that Santa Claus is real? It always seemed challenging for me.
It's something else. It becomes something else, right? But my answer is, I think instead of like our ancestors who picked up Hellenistic traditions from the West, I think your predecessor at Beth Sholom has shown maybe we can look east, right? And find some answers there, which tell you, and maybe in supported, by Kohelet, for example, that everything happens, right? Everything happens, and it might happen to you, and it might happen to somebody else. And what our tradition teaches us is how to deal with it when it happens, right? That is, I think, more of an Eastern sort of outlook that maybe we can borrow from.
Next time we're going to be joined by Ephraim Margolin, who's going to give us a wonderful session on Choni, the chocolate, the circle maker, the chocolate maker. I just made Choni a chocolate maker, the circle maker. But I want to follow up on your point. Say it again.
There is for everything there is a season. Everything will happen eventually. right? Everything will happen to somebody.
And we need to find the
And
right-
maybe it'll be you, and maybe it'll be someone else, right? It's not really important whether it's you or somebody else. What's important is when it does happen to you, what do you do with it? And that's really the only answer we can provide.
Yeah, the Near Eastern thing where I thought you were going with that is like 2,000 years ago, we adopted Greek thought, right? He just
Right.
went. So now you could say Rabbi Lou adopted Near Eastern thought.
Far Eastern. Far Eastern.
Far Eastern, correct. Excuse me. Near Eastern thought is what we're doing here. Far Eastern thought, that's correct. Well, maybe there's another type of thought. And I think Judaism needs to be, and has been historically, we should read The Blessing of Assimilation by Gerson D. Cohen. Basically, for 2,000s of years, we have assimilated from the best ideas of those around us in a way that has supported our Torah and our tradition. Just like Rabbi Lou used Far East to support Judaism, so did Maimonides use Aristotle to support Judaism. Gary.
I'm trying to synthesize some of this with the singling out of the individual versus in Judaism, we don't want to do that. And I always thought it was beautiful, the idea like when we count a minion, we don't count a minion because we don't want to single the person out for judgment. And we feel that the collective judgment of the group will take care of all of the onus that might fall on one person who might fall short. And if we take that as like a paradigm for everything in Judaism, caring for community and everything, how does that fit in with this kind of worldview on, judgment from of myself? I mean, it's kind of like why on Yom Kippur we, when we do the vidui, it's collective, it's not singular.
In the beginning, I'll give you the example that moved me in my life and sort of changed the trajectory of my life. Because I studied a lot, I was a philosophy major, I studied a lot of moral relativism in college. And then I read Franz Rosenzweig's The Star of Redemption. So he was this classical Hegelian philosopher who wrote his classic book from the Balkans in the middle of World War I, from the trenches, and sent it back on postcards to his mom. And the book begins by saying, for all of the philosophy, I'm paraphrasing, of course, for all of the philosophy that I've learned and studied and PhD and Nietzsche and Hegel, none of it, because I'm a part of a people or I'm a part of an all or I'm a part of a community, none of it keeps the fear when those projectiles fly by my head. None of it helps quench that fear. Quench? I might have made up that word. Quench that fear of death that I feel personally. So all of the philosophy, Rosenzweig said, all of that stuff, none of it spoke to him and addressed his death. And he said that. He goes, it doesn't make me feel better because I'm the one who's dying. And that's the classic existential POV. And that it was from, that is something that needed to be dealt with and still does. But thank you, Gary, for a good question. Thank you, everybody, for engaging with me, whether you followed along, whether you liked his framework. I love that Rabbi Gillman always asks the hard questions, but sometimes leaves you slightly dissatisfied at the end. Anyway, hopefully that'll continue the conversation. Come next week, Ephraim is going to be joining us for what should be a lively discussion. Take care.